Vlog number 22, November 1st, 1708, day 1. So in case you're new to my channel, my ghost name is Amrook. I am not going to give my real name out yet. And I am an autistic adult, 38 years old as of this recording. And yeah, I figure I'd share my insights with the world. I figure it'd be a good idea since apparently my insights are pretty unusual. And yeah. And all my video counts are in base 12 or dozenal count, not in base 10. So in case you come across some weird numberings such as 10-teen or 11-teen, that's the reason, because base 12 is clearly superior to base 10, so why not just use it? But with that out of the way, I wanted to talk about perspective and what it is and how it works, because perspective basically makes your reality. And it's very important to understand how perspective works if you want to change your reality. So, perspective is basically a chosen vision. And that vision is based upon the music that your mind has. And of course, the written music, as I stated in a previous video, comes from the heart intelligence. So, that's basically the chain of causation. And it's really not so much about what we perceive, but how we perceive it. And how we perceive something can change radically. It's like there's so many different ways of seeing something, and that is part of the fun in this reality. It's like there's a lot of people that may want to manipulate others' perceptions of whatever subject that they wish to make them see in a certain way. But the reality of it is you actually have the control to change whatever perspective you want. And that is one of the control mechanisms that the elite use and when they try to steer the crowd's desires and thoughts towards them, is just to shift their perspective into one that makes them think that they will be getting something that they want. And it's an old trick of the book. First thing with perspective is always to be aware of the fact that this may not be the only way to see the subject that you're looking at. There may be other ways of doing so. And one of the easiest ways to keep the mind from becoming too rigid in a certain perspective is to remember that this illusionary reality is relative. So it could change depending on a variety of factors. And it's really mankind who makes relative reality so rigid. In fact, mankind chooses to make themselves rigid. I think because of the fear of change. And I've been thinking about lately, in past civilizations, there's a cycle where out of the rubble of a previous civilization, a certain group culture will open their minds and essentially embrace the centropic mind spiral upwards into the lower heavens, at least, in order to build and manifest their new civilization. And once this civilization is manifest, they suddenly become locked down and they go rigid, as if they fear losing it. And in response to their fear of losing it, they developed this intricate belief system that attempts to keep people from walking out of line of that culture. And unfortunately, this belief system is often out of fear of the society crumbling. And as I talked about in my previous video, number 21, hatred can be a part of that fear. And if there is no love to balance it, then it eventually becomes stagnant. And essentially, a system has to be living. The system has to be a living system in order for it to survive. If it's not living, then it basically just goes stale and rigid, and the entropic processes take over, and it slowly decays until eventually breaks down into dysfunctionality and eventually revolution, and then history basically repeats itself like this over and over. So one way to avoid this cycle is to always keep in mind that there are many different perspectives one can have on only a single subject. It's simple in theory, but of course it's one of the hardest things that man can do is to change their perspective, because it's essentially rooted in higher thought forms that act as a foundation for one's life. So it comes down to being able to connect one's conscious minds into their subconscious and unconscious programmings, which is essentially the wheels behind the clock, and tinker with the wheels a little bit and essentially change the vision of whatever it is they are looking at. So it's like, okay, sure, the thought forms that I learned basically told me I have to look at reality this way. But I can't forget the fact that those thought forms I learned, there might be other thought forms that may allow me to see that subject in a different way. And suddenly that subject's bad. And of course, I wasn't told that because the person who was telling me those thought forms want me to see that subject with a certain perspective for their own benefit. So, yes, perspective is definitely, at least starting out, it's definitely not something that's easy. It's something that takes practice and it takes time. But once the muscle memory kicks in and the brain essentially flexes itself, switching to different perspectives is just like another unconscious mechanism, essentially. So if there's another perspective that's needed, if there's enough unconscious programming, it can just simply switch that perspective. And not only that, but with enough awareness, immediately just have an unconscious programming to ask and see whether there are other perspectives available. And this is, of course, requires a quite great deal of understanding other thought forms that serve as foundations for one's reality. This could be anywhere from spirituality to science, of course, on that seesaw that man has made for himself. But if one mixes the two together, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be the case, if one mixes the two together, one finds the fulcrum point where no matter really what it is one is looking at, someone, you could basically look at that subject and say, okay, is this something I should approach from a scientific point of view? And as such, shall I approach it from the lamestream science point of view, or should I approach it from an alternative science point of view? And if so, is that even going to be correct or not? And let's see, it's like all these other different possibilities. Or like, oh, well, this subject, okay, maybe what kind of spiritual point of view do I want to look at this from? Do I want to look at this from Buddhist, Taoist, Christian, Islamic, from a Bonpo perspective? Do I want to look at it from some kind of Native American perspective? Or perhaps I'll just use my own independent thought and findings and just look at it from this perspective. It's like, all of these eventually, with enough training, they just come out from the back of the mind, because life has certain patterns to it, and once these patterns are recognized, it just immediately comes out, and one knows which thought form foundation to assign to their perspective. And I think the whole pattern thing is something I probably should explain in another video, because that is just a whole speech in and of itself. But essentially, just on a basic note, reality has patterns to it and cycles, and learning to recognize those patterns and cycles is one of the ways of understanding how your reality works. It's not just the biorhythms that we go through. It's not just the usual day-to-day grind, but it's also your spiritual and emotional cycles that we go through. A lot of people are not aware that they actually go through such cycles. They just happen. And the first step, of course, is to become aware that they are simply repeating themselves. And the reason why they're repeating themselves is because they have not been learned yet. And this goes down to spiritual lessons, which is why we are here as humans, is to evolve the soul through lessons on the earth. So, yeah, that part was a bit of a tangent, but it's all very important and tied to perspective and how it works. Because cycles, they act as markers. So if one has a perspective at a certain moment in their cycle, and they put a marker on it saying, okay, I saw this moment with this perspective, and then they have the awareness to see that a very similar moment occurs later in time, then their perspective may change, because they may have learned something that may go against the previous one. But now this is increased data, and this gives a much wider perspective than it would be previous. So in fact, you've become enriched by it, and there's nobody telling you that you can't do this. So there's that. Yeah, okay, well, I hope this video helped with perspective a bit. It's kind of a complicated subject. And yes, it is one of the hardest things people can do. But it's also not something that I can blanket statement for everybody either. It's something that, of course, will depend on your inner kingdom. And it also depends on whether people are aware of what makes up the foundations of their mind, because a lot of it comes down to that also. And a lot of it comes down to their capacity for being aware of said foundations and being able to switch out for other visions that can color that perceived object as something completely different. So there is a lot to it. But this is a good overview for now, at least. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, well, that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.